She expected cruelty. Instead, she received a letter so tender, so wildly improper by every standard of war, that her hands trembled and her throat burned. In a quiet corner of an American POW camp in California, a young Japanese nurse sat cross-legged on a wooden cot, her fingers shaking as she unfolded the letter. The paper was rough, the ink smudged in places, but what unsettled her wasn't the language, it was the voice behind it. The man, a former ranch hand from Amarillo, wrote not like a guard, not like a victor, but like a man struck dumb by beauty. He called her ma'am. He described the curve of her handwriting as gentle as a sunrise on dry plains. And then he asked, politely, shamelessly, if he might write again. No soldier should write to a prisoner. No enemy should see a woman behind a uniform. Yet she did not burn the letter. She read it again and again, until her breath caught and her chest ached in ways she did not understand. It had been handed to her beneath the splintered mess table, folded once, smudged with a fingerprint in the corner. No name, no envelope, only a crease and the shape of temptation. The guard hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked at her. Just passed by during morning cleanup, slipped it into her palm with the same mechanical motion as he handed out spoons or trays. She barely noticed at first. Her hand closed around it instinctively, more muscle than mind. But once the bell rang and the others filed out, leaving behind the dregs of coffee and the thick scent of boiled eggs, she sat frozen. Her fingers, stained with the ink of the infirmary and the grit of kitchen soap, slowly unfurled. There it was, a letter. Her name not written but understood. The first word was ma'am, not prisoner, not you, just ma'am. Her breath hitched. She hadn't been called anything with reverence in months. In this place, names were things barked at roll call, identities reduced to numbers. But here, in unfamiliar English script, was something that did not feel like an order. It felt like a door. Her eyes traced each line carefully, the cadence foreign but strangely soothing. The grammar was uneven. Some words were misspelled. Others seemed pulled from books, as if the man behind the letter had scavenged poetry to shape his thoughts. He described the sky that morning, how it stretched over the camp like a saddle blanket shaken clean. He said her handwriting from the infirmary logbook was the softest curve this side of the Mississippi. She didn't know where the Mississippi was, but the way he wrote it, she didn't need to. The absurdity of it struck her. An American soldier, a cowboy no less, watching her write from across the wire and crafting metaphors as if she were some character in a dime novel. Yet even as her mind screamed impossible, her cheeks flushed hot. Her body betrayed her. It wasn't lust, not exactly. It was something older, deeper, the sensation of being seen. She folded the letter again quickly, like it might catch fire in her lap. Her heart raced. Around her the camp buzzed with its usual routines, laundry clapping on lines, boots scuffing gravel, a harmonica whining from the far barracks. But inside, the world was no longer still. A letter had opened her chest like a scalpel, not to wound, but to awaken. She pressed the paper to her thigh, hiding it beneath her skirt. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, exactly. From the certainty that everything had just changed. The danger was obvious. Fraternization was forbidden. Communication with guards outside of official duties could mean punishment for both. And yet the letter wasn't lewd or mocking. It wasn't filled with the vulgar fantasies she'd heard whispered about in darker corners of the war. No, it was kind, respectful, improper only because of its gentleness. There was one line she could not stop rereading. "I don't know your name," he had written, "but when you looked up at the light last Thursday, it made me forget my boots hurt." She had looked up because a hawk had passed overhead. She remembered the sun striking the wire, remembered shielding her eyes. She hadn't known he saw her. She hadn't known anyone did. A strange sound escaped her throat, part sigh, part laughter. She covered her mouth, startled. No one else had heard. For the first time since her capture, she felt a weight lift that wasn't physical. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was possibility. And it terrified her. The letter, tucked beneath her thin mattress, would become a secret she both feared and craved. That night, as she lay staring at the ceiling, her fingers reached for it without meaning to. She read it again, mouthing the words like prayers in a language she did not yet understand. A cowboy had written her a poem, and she, a woman trained for death, had wept quietly in the dark. Before the war, before the blood and the shame, she had sat in starched white linen, knees together, back straight, repeating words not her own. Endurance is strength. Pain is silence. Capture is dishonor. The nurses' college in Tokyo was more temple than school. Clean floors, cleaner speech, and eyes that never wandered. They were not trained to feel. They were trained to serve. The lectures were strict, filled with diagrams of human anatomy and the art of obedience. They were told how to treat infection, how to disinfect wounds, and most of all, how to preserve a soldier's dignity, even as his limbs were gone. But there was something else they were taught, always beneath the surface. You are a shield for the empire. You do not cry. You do not speak to the enemy. And if you are taken, you do not return. There had been one afternoon when the lights flickered during a lecture. The instructor, a woman who had once served in Manchuria, paused her speech about battlefield triage and instead told them a story. A captured nurse, she said, once bit off her own tongue rather than speak to the Americans. The room was silent. The implication was clear. To survive was shame. That night she folded her uniform with reverence, pressing the creases as if they could guard her from weakness. She prayed to disappear before capture. She believed back then that she was ready. But nothing in Tokyo prepared her for the Pacific. The jungle did not care for creeds or creases. Sweat blurred the lines between soldier and animal. She worked in makeshift tents, her hands raw from gauze and salt water, the screams of dying men etching themselves into her spine. There was so little medicine. Sometimes she crushed leaves into paste and hoped it helped. Sometimes all she could do was hold a hand until it stopped twitching. The officers rarely spoke to her beyond orders. She was expected to appear, assist, disappear. Food grew scarce. They ate rice mixed with bark, broth made from boiled leather. At night, she wrote fake letters home to a mother she had not seen in years, pretending there was warmth left in the world. There were no mirrors, no time for dreams, only the slow rot of skin and morale. Then came the retreat. The sky, she remembered, was too blue for the madness that followed. Her unit broke apart. Orders collapsed. She ran for 3 days without knowing if the war had ended or not. She expected the enemy to shoot her on sight. But when they found her, knees in mud, a bloodied bandage still tied around her waist, they did not shoot. A man in a clean uniform offered her water. Another called for a medic. The world did not tilt. It shattered. She waited for the torture, for the humiliation. But it never came. They gave her food, they gave her clothes, and when she tried to speak, tried to find the words for surrender in English, they told her gently, "It's over." In the first days of her captivity, she refused to eat more than a spoonful. She suspected poison. When they gave her soap, She smelled it for an hour before daring to use it, and when another nurse, a Korean woman captured months earlier, told her the Americans were not what she had been taught, she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "They are men," she said. "All men are dangerous." But over time, she began to observe. The guards were strange, yes, but not cruel. Some smiled without reason. One sang while sweeping. Another carried a picture of his dog. And the cowboy, she remembered him from the infirmary, had helped lift a stretcher without being asked. He had looked at her once, then away, as if afraid to see too much. Still, she did not speak to them. She did not want kindness. She did not want confusion. And then came the letter. And everything she had been built to withstand began to fracture, quietly, from within. His name was Will Tucker, but everyone called him Tucker, like he was just another one of the horses back home. Born in the panhandle of Texas, he came from a place where men didn't talk much unless it was about the sky, the cattle, or the heat. His father's hands were blistered before the boy could walk, and by the time Tucker turned 12, he was riding fence lines before breakfast and patching saddles at night. The war had come too fast, and by the time he'd volunteered, they told him he was too old for combat. 28, ancient by infantry standards, so they stuck him in a uniform, handed him a clipboard, and said, "Guard the ones we caught." He didn't mind, not at first. The camp was quiet. The prisoners didn't scream or spit like the ones in the movies. Most were women, thin and sun-starved, silent in a way that rattled the bones. They kept their eyes down. They moved like ghosts. He figured it was better that way, safer, cleaner. But then came the day he saw her. It was in the infirmary. He had been helping unload crates of linens, sweating through his shirt even though it was barely past dawn. She was bent over a cot, adjusting a bandage on another prisoner's ankle. The room smelled like iodine and old sweat, but she didn't flinch. Her hands were precise, her posture straight as a fence post. She didn't look up, not once. But something in her stillness struck him harder than a bullet ever could have. She wasn't beautiful in the way magazines sold. She wasn't trying to be anything. That was what startled him. She was present, alive, even in silence. He watched as she wiped her hands, took a step back, and bowed slightly, not to the guard, but to the woman she had just helped. A gesture so small and sacred it nearly made his throat close. After that, he noticed her everywhere. At breakfast, sitting straight while others slouched. In the garden, watching birds while others worked. In the chapel tent, her face expressionless as the others whispered prayers. She moved like someone who remembered a world before war. Or maybe someone who still carried it inside her. He told himself it was just curiosity, a fluke of memory. But then, one day, while gathering logs near the tool shed, he passed the infirmary again. She was there, alone, writing in a logbook with a pen too thin for comfort. The way her wrist moved, slow, deliberate, reminded him of the way his mother used to thread needles on cold nights. Grace in necessity. That night, lying on his cot, he thought about her writing, about her fingers, her posture, the wrinkle between her brows. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he found himself tearing a page from a worn ledger in the guard post. He sat behind the mess hall with a pencil stub and stared at the blank paper for what felt like an hour. What could he even say? What should he say? Nothing. That was the right answer. Rules were clear. Lines existed for reasons, and yet he didn't want to ask her anything. He didn't want anything from her. He just wanted to let her know she had been seen, that someone had noticed she was more than a uniform, more than silence. So he wrote, badly, clumsily. He wrote about the wind that morning, about how it reminded him of dust storms back home. He wrote about her handwriting, said it looked like prairie grass bending under sun. He signed it only with Tucker, and when he slipped the note into her hand, he didn't look back. He walked away quickly, boots crunching gravel, pretending his pulse wasn't screaming in his ears. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that with that single letter, the war for her had shifted, not ended, but changed. And so had he. It began with the sheets. She hadn't expected them to be clean. That first night, after the letter, she slid beneath the cotton and felt something that made her flinch. Softness. Not the scratchy wool of military cots or the damp rot of makeshift tents. These were clean, dry, sun-warmed sheets. She lay still for a long time, eyes wide in the dark, trying to remember the last time her skin had touched something that wasn't survival. She couldn't. It terrified her. The food came next. Real food. Eggs, bread, coffee that was bitter but hot. She sipped it slowly, watching the steam rise from the tin cup like a ghost. No one shouted, no one shoved. The guards, always distant, always watchful, moved with a kind of practiced ease, like men who didn't need to prove they had power. She waited for the cruelty to come hidden in kindness. But it never did. What came instead was confusion. She folded her sheets each morning like she had in Tokyo, precise corners and crisp edges. But the camp was not a place of punishment. It was not paradise either, but it was something else. The structure reminded her of a hospital more than a prison. There were rules, yes, but there were also moments of stillness. At night, the silence unnerved her most. Back in the Pacific, the dark had meant death. Mosquitoes, moans, the slow fading of men who had no medicine left. But here there was only the creak of bunks, the shuffling of guards outside, and, sometimes, the faint sound of a harmonica. One of the Americans, a young one with nervous hands, played it low, like a lullaby. It was always the same tune, slow, circular. It wound through the barracks like smoke, curling beneath their thin walls and settling in the places no words could reach. She didn't know how to feel. Then there were the others. Her fellow nurses, other women captured from different islands, began to change. Not suddenly, but in small, unmistakable ways. They laughed more, whispered at night. Some braided each other's hair. One began sketching faces in the margins of old newspapers. Another asked the guard for more soap, and smiled when she received it. The silence that once ruled them began to break. They spoke of the guards, at first in low voices, jokes about their big boots, how clumsy they were, how strange it was that they always said "ma'am" and tipped their caps. Slowly, the tone shifted. One woman admitted she felt safer here than she had during the final months of service. Another confessed she had dreamed of a chocolate bar, and woke to find it on her tray. It was dangerous, all of it. They knew that. The war was not over, not truly. Their families were still somewhere out there, starving, grieving, loyal to the emperor. But something inside the walls of the camp did not match what they had been taught. There were no monsters here, only men. And that was its own kind of terror. Because if the enemy was not evil, then what had they been fighting? If kindness could exist behind the wire, then what else might be true? She found herself looking for him. The cowboy. Not obviously. Never for long. Just a glance when dishes were passed, when logs were carried, when boots tapped past her tent. He never stared, never approached. But once she caught him pausing at the fence near the garden, eyes lifted toward the hawk circling overhead. He remembered. That night she dreamed of wind through prairie grass, though she had never seen it, and when she woke, the sheets still warm from her body, she thought she heard the harmonica playing something new. She sat up, and the crack inside her widened. She didn't mean to write him back. In fact, she told herself she wouldn't, that it was safer, wiser, more loyal to the woman she had been trained to be. But later that afternoon, as sunlight bled through the thin canvas of the infirmary tent, she found her hand drifting toward a scrap of paper left near the supply shelf. It wasn't even proper stationery, just a torn corner of a medical form, the back blank and slightly creased. She stared at it for a long time. Her pulse tapped at her throat, quick and unsteady. Shame made her fingers curl inward. But another feeling, quieter, unfamiliar, insistent, kept them from closing fully. It was not longing, not attraction. It was simply the strange, jolting awareness of being recognized as someone who still had a voice. She sat on the stool, placed the paper on her knee, and held the pencil as if it might bite. The first attempt produced nothing but a trembling line across the page. She erased it with her thumb, smudging the paper. Her second attempt was no better. The pencil hovered, waiting for a command she could not give. For so long, words had been tools, for triage reports, for supply requests, for recording the dead. Now they were something more dangerous, something personal. Finally, she drew a single, steady breath and began with the smallest thing she could offer, a drawing. A tiny cherry blossom, its petals curling outward, sketched in the far corner, not because she wanted to send beauty, but because she needed to remember she could still create something that wasn't pain. Underneath it, she wrote a few lines in careful English, childlike, tentative, but hers. I remember a tree outside my mother's window. It bloomed early every spring. She paused, the memory soft and startling. She hadn't thought about that tree in years. She let the pencil rest, then added, I do not understand why you wrote to me. That was enough. More than enough. It frightened her how much that single question revealed. She folded the paper twice, then held it to her chest for a moment before hiding it in her sleeve. She told herself she wouldn't give it to him. She told herself she would burn it. Instead, that evening, when he passed the water buckets down the line, she let the folded note slide from her palm into his. She didn't look up. Neither did he. The night that followed was restless. She lay awake listening to footsteps outside, the distant hum of guards exchanging shifts, and the low, slow cry of the harmonica drifting toward dawn. She wondered if he had read it, if he understood her English, if he laughed, if he regretted ever writing her in the first place. Threads of worry tangled with something else, something like anticipation, but gentler, like the breath before a prayer. 2 days passed. Nothing. Not a glance, not a gesture, not a sign. She forced herself to accept that perhaps silence was the reply. Perhaps that was better. Then, on the third morning, she found a folded slip beneath her bowl. Her heart stopped. Tucker, it said at the end, though the letter itself was longer, written in the same uneven script as before. He told her about early blossoms in Texas that weren't cherry trees but cottonwoods, shedding pale fluff that drifted like snow. He told her he had never been farther from home than this camp, and that sometimes he wrote things down because speaking them felt too heavy. And then one line, simple, unadorned, rested in the middle of the page like a stone dropped in still water. I wrote to you because you looked like someone remembering something kind. That was all. No flattery, no request, just a truth she had not expected, from a man she barely knew. She folded the letter slowly, her hands steady for the first time in months, and realized she was no longer floating through her days like a ghost. She existed again. Now, each morning held a different kind of weight. Not the heaviness of dread, but the fragile anticipation of maybe. Maybe another letter would come. Maybe she would find it folded beneath a bowl, slipped beneath a cot, tucked between pages of an old ration ledger. She told herself she wasn't waiting, that it didn't matter, that it was merely curiosity, not need. But when she peeled open the next note and saw the rough scrawl of his pen, she felt breath return to places inside her that had long gone still. The letters became her oxygen. They were never long. Just a few lines, sometimes a story from his ranch, sometimes a memory of childhood, a stubborn mule, a sunrise over mesquite trees, the way horses could smell storms before they broke. He asked no questions of her, not at first, only gave pieces, and she absorbed them. She read them in secret, rewrote them in her mind, carried phrases with her like charms. Once, when folding bandages, she realized she had been whispering one of his lines under her breath. "The sky back home doesn't end, it just fades." Her bunkmates noticed, the slight flush in her cheeks after morning mail, the way she turned away quickly. One asked if she had caught a fever. She only smiled and said the air was warmer now. But warmth was the problem. It spread, not through her heart, but through her skin. Her hands trembled when she opened his notes. Her breath hitched when she saw his handwriting. At night she dreamed of strange things. Not of him exactly, but of movement, of wind across open plains, of dance steps she had never learned. She would wake startled, heart racing, cheeks hot, and press her palms against her face as if to push the heat back in. This wasn't romance. Not yet. It was awakening, the slow, shattering return of sensation in a body that had gone numb. She felt traitorous for it, not to her captors, but to herself, to the version of her that had once knelt in front of a camisa, bowing to the ideals of self-sacrifice and silence. That woman had vanished, and in her place stood someone curious, alert, trembling. Then came the line she could not forget. "If I were a braver man," he wrote one afternoon, "I would ask if you ever danced." There was no signature, no explanation, just that. She read it 3 times, then folded it so tightly the creases nearly tore. She did not know what it meant. Not exactly. But her body did. Her fingers closed around the paper and held it for hours, even as she stitched torn sleeves and washed old gauze. "If I were a braver man—" The sentence looped like a song she couldn't shake. Was it a question, a memory, a regret? She had never danced. Not truly, not without direction, not with abandon. There were no dances in her childhood, only drills. There were no waltzes in the Pacific, only blood. And yet, in the stillness of the barracks that night, she rose from her cot, placed her bare feet on the cold floor, and took one slow step forward. Then another. She didn't sway. She didn't spin. But she moved. Alone, silent, unseen, her own kind of dance. A reply he would never witness, but one she had to give. The fire underneath wasn't desire, not exactly. It was the dangerous, disarming awareness that even in the most impossible place on earth, something tender was still alive. And it was beginning to burn. She told no one. Not about the letters, not about the way she now looked at the sky with new attention, as if even the clouds could speak. But secrets do not remain quiet forever in close quarters. One morning, after roll call, she returned to find her cot stripped and her belongings unsettled. A letter, one she had reread too many times, had slipped from its hiding place beneath her mattress. The edges were worn, smudged with the oils of her fingers. A folded petal of trust, now flattened under the boot of suspicion. Aya, the woman in the next bunk, held it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, not yet cruel. "Do you think he sees you as a woman? Or as a pet?" The words struck harder than any blow. Aya had lost a brother in the Philippines. She had once stitched together a soldier's leg without morphine. Her silence had always carried weight. For her to speak now, to accuse, to wound, meant the fracture ran deep. "I didn't ask for it," the nurse whispered. "No," Aya said, "but you kept it." For the rest of that day, the camp felt smaller. The walls of the barracks leaned inward. Every glance carried weight. She kept her eyes down, hands busy, lips pressed together in a prayer she no longer knew how to recite. Shame curled around her like smoke. Was Aya right? Was this foolish, dangerous, deluded? That night, lying awake beneath the mosquito netting, the nurse let the question unravel inside her. She remembered her training, the lectures in Tokyo that warned of corruption, of the foreigner's smile. She remembered the screams of dying men on hospital floors, the orders to preserve honor above life. And now she was writing letters to a man who had once worn the uniform of the enemy. What was she doing? And yet, the silence of withdrawal was louder than the shame of engagement. In the days that followed, she tried to stop herself from hoping. She turned her back when he walked past. She folded laundry until her fingers cracked. She refused to look at the horizon, but the hunger remained. Not for him, not for touch, but for witness. For someone who saw her not as a war criminal, not as a number, not even as a woman, but as a whole, uncollapsed person. And in that absence, something broke loose again. She wrote once more. No trembling this time, no cherry blossoms or apologies, just plain words, measured, honest. "You asked if I had ever danced," she wrote. "No, but sometimes I think I hear music now, when the wind moves." She did not sign it. She did not draw anything. She left it beneath a folded towel on the shelf near the supply tent. She did not look when he passed by later, but she heard his boots pause for just a breath longer than usual. When she returned to her bunk that evening, she found a reply hidden in the hollow of her water jug. "I don't know if I deserve your words," it said, "but I carry them with me like I used to carry saddle reins. Gentle, always careful." Her hands tightened around the page. The shame was still there, but smaller now, like the last glowing coal in a fire that once threatened to consume her. She didn't need forgiveness. She needed truth. And the truth was silence. The kind that made her invisible was the worst sin of all. It happened with no warning, no build-up, no intention. Just emotion so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one around them noticed. He was handing her a book, a worn, dirt-stained manual from the infirmary shelf. She reached for it too quickly. His hand was still there. Their fingers touched. Only for a second, maybe less. But the world didn't move after that second. Not for her. The warmth of his skin struck her like a bell rung in the hollow of her chest. It wasn't a grasp. There was no pressure, no hold, just the brush of two lives intersecting in a way the world said they never should. It should have meant nothing, but to her it felt like being seen in full daylight after years in a dim room. She blinked. He froze, and then he pulled away, quickly, sharply, as if contact had burned him, as if the air had turned electric and he had touched a wire he didn't know was live. His eyes flicked to hers for half a breath, wide, startled, caught between apology and something deeper. Then he stepped back and said nothing. The book remained in her hands. She didn't open it. Later, her body betrayed her. Her fingers kept seeking the shape of his touch, not in craving, but in confirmation. Had it happened? Had she imagined it? Her hands hovered over the same spot, as if the memory of warmth might still be hidden in the skin. Her breath caught in her throat every time footsteps passed the infirmary door. She knew it meant danger, not just to herself, to him, to the fragile, word-spun bridge they had built across the gulf of war and shame. And yet, what filled her in that moment wasn't fear. It was hunger, not for romance, but for aliveness, for the sudden, staggering knowledge that her body could still feel. The years of training had taught her discipline, control, to endure, not to desire. And now, here she was, standing in a place where simple human connection felt more explosive than any battlefield. She sat that night with the book unopened on her lap, staring at its spine, her thumb pressing into the spot where their hands had met. He didn't return that evening, or the next. She didn't write. Neither did he. But then, on the third day, a note appeared, tucked in the folded edge of a fresh towel, barely a sentence long. "Forgive me. I shouldn't have let it happen." She read it 3 times. Then, slowly, she tore it in half. Not out of anger, not out of rejection, but because it wasn't something to be kept. That moment didn't belong on paper. It belonged only to breath and time and the dangerous silence of memory. She didn't respond. But when they crossed paths again 2 days later, she nodded. Just once. He did too. No words, no smile, nothing visible. But it was enough. Because they both knew something had passed between them. Something that had no name, not love, not temptation. Something quieter, more human, more fragile. In a world built on walls and wire, they had touched without orders. And now everything was different. If you're feeling this story, like this video and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. It happened on a morning that began like any other. The crisp clang of the breakfast bell, the low murmur of footsteps on gravel, the soft rustle of canvas lifting in the breeze. She had tucked his most recent note inside the hem of her sleeve, intending to reread it during her break. A single line, simple and steady. "I hope the days are kinder to you." But before she could slip away, a voice barked her name. Not Tucker's, not anyone familiar. Sergeant Halverson stood in the doorway of the barracks, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, the type of man whose eyes missed nothing. He held something in his fist, a torn scrap of paper, crumpled by rough hands, ink smudged by sweat. Her breath stilled. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. He didn't need her answer. The name at the bottom, Tucker, said enough. A second guard seized her arm. Not roughly, but firmly, and guided her outside. She expected shouting. She expected interrogation. She expected confinement, punishment, isolation. Instead, they merely searched her things with mechanical efficiency. No cruelty, no questions. They found 2 more notes, one drawing, one half-torn scrap. All were taken. Then they told her to return to her duties. That was the punishment. Not blows, not threats. Silence. Tucker did not appear that day, or the next. His station near the infirmary was reassigned. The familiar rhythm of his boots on the gravel vanished. She asked nothing. No prisoner dared ask about a guard, but within her something frayed, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like thread pulled too slowly to notice until it snaps. The camp seemed colder without the possibility of words. She folded sheets without feeling their softness. She cleaned wounds without hearing the breath of the women she tended. Even the harmonica, once a fragile comfort in the evenings, became a reminder of everything she had lost. She tried to hold herself upright, to remember her training, her vows, her strength. A soldier endures, a nurse serves, a woman of her homeland swallows grief until it hardens into pride. But what she faced now was different. It was not death, it was not fear, it was unbeing. Without the letters, the walls of the camp closed in. Her meals went unfinished. She stirred her spoon through soup until the surface cooled, and a guard gently removed the bowl, thinking she was ill. She no longer wrote, not even the small lists required in the infirmary. Another nurse took over her entries after noticing her handwriting had shrunk into unreadable scratches. Her sleep became broken. In the early hours of the morning, she found herself waking with her hand curled into the shape of holding paper that was no longer there. The women around her noticed. They whispered, "She's weakening. She's frightened. She's mourning something." But none of them understood that mourning did not always require death. Sometimes it required only the removal of the one thing that kept a soul tethered. Days stretched thin, then thinner. She found herself drifting through tasks as if her spirit lagged behind her body, unable to keep up. The smallest things, a guard's laugh, a gust of wind carrying dust, a book misplaced on a shelf, broke her focus. Sometimes she stopped walking entirely. Anchored by nothing but air, she checked the place where letters used to appear, just once, then again, then every afternoon until it became a quiet desperation she despised herself for. Still nothing. Whatever part of her had opened, cautiously, painfully, bravely, now felt exposed to the cold. And with every day of silence, it shrank, not away from him, away from herself. By the end of the week, she moved with the weight of someone carrying invisible chains. She ate little, spoke less, dreamed not at all. For the second time since her capture, she felt the world closing in. But this time it was not war that imprisoned her. It was the absence of a voice that had once told her she existed. When the war ended, it didn't come with drums or fanfare. There was no grand announcement in her camp, no sudden cheering, just a quiet shift. Orders stopped arriving, schedules blurred. One day, the guards no longer checked the gates with the same precision. Another day, a rumor spread. The ships were coming. And then, all at once, it was real. They were going home. She boarded a transport bound for Yokohama with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single item stitched into the lining of her coat. A folded letter she had memorized by heart. Not the one he'd written last, the first. The one that had startled her into being, the one that began it all. She didn't know if he had been reassigned, discharged, punished. She never saw him again. But the words stayed. She carried them across the sea. When she arrived in Tokyo, the station was half rubble. The city she had grown up in looked like a ghost of its former self. Bones of buildings, fractured streets, people moving like smoke through the ruins. Her mother met her in silence. There were no tears, no embrace, just a long, searching stare, as if she wasn't sure who this woman was. And perhaps she wasn't. The daughter she had raised was dutiful, controlled, hardened by ideology. But the woman who stood before her had been broken in ways that did not show on skin. There were no visible wounds, only a quietness that came from having felt too much and spoken too little. They lived in a small room above a tea shop, with paper walls that fluttered in the wind. Each night, the nurse, no longer a nurse, no longer anything defined by uniform, sat by the window and unfolded that letter. She read it slowly, eyes lingering on the places where the ink had faded, where creases had softened the edges of his handwriting. I don't know why I'm writing this. I only know that when I see you, I remember that we are not enemies, not really, just people." She had read that line 100 times, and still it made her chest tighten. Years passed. She did not marry. She did not speak of America, but she never stopped writing. Not to him, never again, but in notebooks, on napkins, in the margins of old newspapers. Words spilled from her in ways they never had before, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in fragments, but always with a kind of hunger that only the silenced truly understand. She did not write about love. She wrote about being seen, because in that camp, in that fragile, forbidden correspondence, someone had looked at her and not seen a threat or a prisoner or a foreign body wrapped in uniform. He had seen a person. He had asked if she had ever danced, and in that question she had remembered that she had feet, that she had breath, that she had once existed beyond duty and war. So, when people asked her what she brought home from captivity, what relic, what souvenir, what bitterness, she would smile quietly and say, "Nothing." And that was true, because what she carried wasn't from the camp. It was what had returned inside her, a self that had once been buried beneath obedience and fear, a woman who, against every rule and every silence, had awakened not because someone loved her, but because someone had noticed her. And that, she would come to understand, was enough. If this story moved you, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.